It always begins quietly, almost invisibly. A word censored here, a thought silenced there. At first, people brush it off, saying it's for safety or respect. But soon, something darker starts to take shape. What Victor Davis-Hanson describes as America's dark turn isn't a single event. It's a cultural drift, a slow corrosion of one of the nation's founding principles, the right to think freely and speak without fear. He believes we are watching the slow death of open discourse, replaced by something far more dangerous: ideological policing masquerading as moral virtue. It starts in the universities. The very places once meant to challenge dogma and sharpen the mind have become ideological factories. Students are taught what to think, not how to think. Those who question prevailing narratives risk being ostracized, shamed, or canceled. A generation raised to believe that feelings outweigh facts now dictates the boundaries of acceptable speech. Professors self-censor, speakers are disinvited, and debates are replaced by denunciations. Hanson calls this intellectual cowardice, a system where conformity is rewarded and dissent punished. Then the same mindset leaks into the media. Newsrooms that once championed the First Amendment now act like gatekeepers of truth, deciding which stories deserve to exist. When journalists pick sides, objectivity dies. When certain viewpoints are labeled disinformation, before debate even begins, democracy weakens. Hanson says this is how freedom erodes, not through brute force, but through cultural conditioning. People stop questioning, not because they are forbidden, but because they've been trained to fear the consequences. The rise of cancel culture makes this even more insidious. It's not just public shaming, it's social excommunication. One wrong phrase, one misinterpreted joke, and your career, reputation, and livelihood can vanish overnight. Ordinary people now live under digital surveillance, policed by millions of self-appointed judges online. Hanson compares it to a modern witch hunt, except now the mob wields hashtags instead of torches. The goal isn't justice, it's control. By destroying a few high-profile targets, society learns to censor itself. Fear becomes obedience. Even comedy, the last refuge of truth-telling, isn't safe. Jokes are dissected for offense rather than insight. Words are filtered through ideological tests. Comedians whisper their routines in green rooms, terrified that laughter itself might be taken out of context. Hanson sees this as the ultimate proof that America is losing its cultural confidence. When a society can no longer laugh at itself, it's already halfway to tyranny. But the real danger, he warns, isn't the activists or the censors. It's the silence of those who know better. The scholars, journalists, and citizens who stay quiet, hoping the storm will pass, become complicit through inaction. History shows us that civilizations rarely collapse because of bad ideas. They fall because good people are too afraid to challenge them. Every empire that rotted from within started with a generation that chose comfort over courage. Hanson reminds us that freedom of speech is not a luxury, it's a discipline. It requires thick skin, humility, and the willingness to listen to those we dislike. The Founding Fathers understood that truth emerges not from anonymity, but from conflict. But today, the new orthodoxy teaches the opposite, that disagreement equals hate, and that emotional discomfort is a moral crime. This inversion of values, Hanson says, is how democracies lose their soul. He points to a chilling pattern: once language becomes policed, thought follows. When certain words are forbidden, the ideas behind them die. Soon, only approved narratives remain. A nation that cannot speak freely eventually cannot think freely, and a people who cannot think freely cannot govern themselves. The tragedy, Hanson explains, is that America is doing this willingly. No dictator forced it. No law demanded it. It's happening because millions of citizens decided it's easier to conform than to stand apart. Piers Morgan, known for his sharp tongue and bold opinions, listens in visible discomfort during their exchange. Hanson's calm tone makes his warnings even more unsettling. He isn't ranting, he's diagnosing. We're seeing a new kind of fascism. He says one that doesn't come with uniforms or salutes, but with hashtags and virtue signals. It's fascism of the mind, where social pressure replaces the secret police, and humiliation replaces prison bars. In this world, control isn't imposed, it's internalized, and this control spreads fast. Corporations rewrite their policies to match activist agendas. Tech platforms decide which opinions are allowed online. Even the military and law enforcement agencies adopt ideological language once confined to academia. Hanson calls this a soft coup, a silent transfer of cultural power from citizens to ideologues. America is being redefined from within, not by elected leaders, but by unelected influencers who understand that controlling speech means controlling society. Yet amid this bleak assessment, Hanson still sees hope. He believes every society eventually reaches a point where the pressure to conform becomes unbearable, and that's when the backlash begins. People start speaking up, not because it's safe, but because silence has become intolerable. The pendulum always swings back. The question, he says, is whether America will have the moral courage to let it. He urges people to resist not through outrage, but through truth, to engage, to argue, to refuse the comfort of echo chambers. True tolerance means protecting voices you despise, not just the ones you agree with. That's the test of democracy. The moment you silence one voice, you endanger them all. As the conversation ends, there's a visible pause, one of those rare television silences that speaks louder than words. Morgan, usually quick with comebacks, has none. Because beneath the debate lies an uncomfortable truth: America's greatest threat might not be from foreign enemies, but from the growing intolerance within its own borders. Victor Davis-Hanson's warning is not about politics. It's about civilization itself. When truth becomes partisan, when debate becomes dangerous, when people measure morality by conformity, a free nation stands on the edge of something irreversible. The first step to reclaiming that freedom, he says, is simple: stop being afraid to speak. Because once silence becomes normal, freedom is already gone. It's one of the most unsettling truths Victor Davis-Hanson lays bare. The idea that America's most trusted institutions, once guardians of fairness and justice, have become tools of political warfare. He calls it the weaponization of the system, a process so gradual and sophisticated that most people didn't even notice it happening. The Constitution promised checks and balances, yet what we're witnessing today feels more like checks on opponents and balances in favor of the powerful. Hanson warns that this quiet corruption doesn't happen overnight. It's engineered, layer by layer. Until trust itself collapses, he begins with the justice system. For decades, Americans believed in the principle that no one was above the law. But in recent years, Hanson argues, that sacred belief has been shattered. The law is no longer blind, it's peeking through its own blindfold, deciding who deserves mercy and who deserves punishment. Political loyalty, not guilt or innocence, increasingly determines outcomes. Scandals are buried when they threaten the favored side and magnified when they involve their enemies. When law enforcement becomes a political weapon instead of a neutral arbiter, Hanson says, the rule of law dies. And with it, the moral legitimacy of the state. He reminds Piers Morgan that this isn't just theory, it's visible in plain sight. He points to how intelligence agencies, designed to protect citizens, now interfere in domestic politics. Classified information leaks conveniently before elections. Federal institutions appear to coordinate with media outlets to shape narratives. Instead of serving the people, they serve power. Hanson calls it the deep state, not as a conspiracy, but as a reality. A bureaucracy so large in self, protecting that it acts as its own unelected government. Piers listens, skeptical at first, then leans in as Hanson lays out example after example. The FBI once represented integrity, but now even its image is divided along partisan lines. Some see it as a shield for the elite, others as a hammer against dissent. The Department of Justice, meant to enforce equal laws, is accused of pursuing selective justice, investigating some protests harshly while ignoring others, prosecuting political opponents while turning a blind eye to allies. This selective application of justice, Hanson warns, is how republics fall. When citizens begin to believe that justice depends on your politics, faith in democracy evaporates. But the decay doesn't stop there. The media, the supposed watchdog of power, has become a participant in this weaponization. Hanson says journalism used to challenge authority, now it colludes with it. Stories that harm the favored political class are dismissed as conspiracy theories, while those that attack opponents are treated as undeniable truth, even before evidence emerges. The watchdog has become a lapdog, and public trust in the press is now at historic lows. Once the media aligns with political institutions instead of holding them accountable, the narrative itself becomes a weapon. Truth is no longer discovered, it's manufactured. Then there's big tech, the invisible hand that controls what billions see, read, and believe. Hanson argues that technology companies now function like unelected ministries of information. Algorithms silence inconvenient voices while amplifying approved ones. Political bias is coded into the platforms that claim to be neutral. When free speech depends on the whims of tech executives rather than the rights of citizens, the marketplace of ideas becomes a controlled theater of illusions. Hanson's tone darkens as he describes how quickly this digital censorship spread. The tools built for connection are now instruments of control. He draws a chilling parallel to history. In every civilization that slid into authoritarianism, institutions were not destroyed, they were repurposed. Armies became instruments of domestic control. Courts became weapons against political dissent. Media became propaganda. Hanson believes America is walking down that same path, except it's doing so under the illusion of freedom. The people are told they're free to vote, to speak, to live as they choose. But behind the scenes, the institutions that safeguard those freedoms are being manipulated to produce only one acceptable outcome. The irony, he says, is that this weaponization often happens in the name of saving democracy. Those in power justify every overreach as necessary, every abuse as noble, every double standard as for the greater good. But Hanson reminds us that no tyranny ever announced itself as tyranny. It always arrives cloaked in virtue. When leaders say they must bend the rules to protect the nation, it usually means the rules are already broken. Piers challenges him, asking if Hanson believes the situation is beyond repair. Hanson pauses, thoughtful. Not yet, he says, but we're running out of time. He insists that accountability is still possible, but only if citizens demand it. Institutions don't corrupt themselves, they are corrupted by people who stop believing in their purpose. The cure, he argues, is transparency, sunlight. Every misuse of power must be dragged into the open, every official held to the same standard. Without that, trust will never return. He calls this moment a moral test. The real fight isn't between left and right, it's between truth and power. Every time an institution bends the rules for convenience, it teaches the next generation that integrity is optional. And once a society accepts that decline is inevitable, Hanson's voice grows sharper as he warns that America's enemies don't need to destroy it from the outside. They just need to watch as it rots from within. By the end of the conversation, Piers sits quietly, the weight of Hanson's argument settling in. It's not an easy message to hear, that the very system Americans built to protect freedom might be turning against it. But Hanson's warning isn't hopeless, it's a call to action. The weaponization of institutions can only thrive when people stop watching, stop questioning, and stop caring. The moment the public reclaims its right to scrutinize power, the corruption begins to crumble. Victor Davis-Hanson leaves his audience with a final thought that lingers long after the cameras stop rolling. The strength of a democracy isn't measured by how much power it gives to its institutions, but by how fiercely it holds them accountable. When justice becomes selective, when truth becomes political, and when power hides behind good intentions, that's when freedom begins to fade. And if America doesn't confront that reality now, the weaponized system may one day become irreversible. Victor Davis-Hanson says every great civilization reaches a point when it begins to forget who it is, not because of invasion or disaster, but because it starts to believe its own values no longer matter. That's what he calls America's cultural decay, the slow erosion of national identity, the unraveling of the moral fabric that once united millions under one flag. It's not a sudden collapse. It's a quiet loss of meaning, a slow drift into confusion where the past becomes shameful, traditions are mocked, and the very idea of what it means to be American becomes blurred beyond recognition. He begins by pointing to history. Every empire, from ancient Rome to modern Europe, began to decline not when enemies grew stronger, but when citizens stopped believing in their own story. The Romans once took pride in their culture, their discipline, their gods. But when that pride turned to cynicism, when self-doubt replaced confidence, they started celebrating decay as progress. Hanson believes America is in that same phase now, obsessed with self-criticism, disconnected from its founding ideals, and addicted to tearing down what generations built. Piers Morgan listens intently as Hanson explains how this decay isn't random, it's ideological. The attack on national identity comes disguised as compassion, inclusion, and justice. But beneath those words lies a deliberate effort to erase the shared heritage that once bound the nation together. Schools no longer teach history as a story of progress and perseverance, but as an endless tale of guilt and oppression. Children are taught to see their country not as something to improve, but as something to apologize for. Patriotism is mocked as ignorance, and national pride is labeled extremism. Hanson calls it a moral inversion, where shame replaces honor and self-doubt becomes a virtue. He describes a country where symbols of unity are being replaced by symbols of division. Statues of historical figures are torn down, city names changed, holidays rewritten. Even the flag, once a sacred emblem of freedom, is seen by some as a political statement. Hanson warns that when a people lose connection to their past, they lose their future too. A nation that forgets where it came from cannot know where it's going. Without a unifying story, all that remains is chaos. 1,000 competing identities fighting for recognition, but none willing to share a common destiny. Culture, Hanson says, is the soul of a nation. It's not just art or music, it's the invisible glue that holds society together. It defines what we honor, what we reject, what we strive to be. And right now, that soul is being hollowed out. Entertainment glorifies nihilism, academics preach resentment, and politics feeds division. Heroes are replaced by victims, discipline by indulgence, courage by outrage. Hanson warns that this moral confusion breeds weakness. When society celebrates mediocrity and excuses failure, it kills ambition. When truth becomes subjective, lies become acceptable. And when everything sacred becomes a joke, nothing remains worth defending. Piers asks whether this change is simply the natural evolution of a diverse nation. Hanson shakes his head. No, he says, this isn't evolution, it's self-sabotage. Diversity, he insists, can strengthen a nation only when it's built on shared values. Without those values, hard work, family, respect for the law, belief in liberty, diversity becomes fragmentation. The melting pot becomes a battlefield. Instead of e pluribus unum, out of many one, the country becomes out of one, many. That's not unity, that's disintegration. He talks about the destruction of meritocracy, how excellence is no longer celebrated because it offends the mediocre. Standards are lowered, competition discouraged, success treated as privilege. Hanson warns that this mindset poisons everything from education to the workplace. When effort and talent no longer matter, innovation dies. Civilizations thrive when their best rise to the top. They collapse when equality of outcome replaces equality of opportunity. The result is stagnation, resentment, and decline. The conversation turns darker as Hanson describes what comes next. When nations lose faith in their identity, they turn against themselves. Crime rises because morality weakens. Families break because responsibility fades. Institutions rot because honesty is replaced by ideology. The void left by faith and tradition gets filled with anger, tribalism, and dependency. People no longer serve a higher purpose. They serve their impulses. And in that emptiness, authoritarianism finds fertile ground. Because when people no longer believe in something greater, they become desperate to be ruled. But amid the bleakness, Hanson's words carry a sense of urgency, not despair. He believes this decay can be reversed, but only if America rediscovers pride in its roots. You can't build the future, he says, by burning the past. True progress means learning from history, not erasing it. It means holding on to the principles that made the nation strong: freedom, responsibility, faith, and the belief that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. Those values built everything America stands on. Without them, there's nothing left but the noise of outrage and the chaos of division. He reminds Morgan that America's story has always been one of renewal. From civil wars to cultural revolutions, it has fallen and risen many times before. What makes it exceptional is not perfection, but resilience, the ability to rebuild stronger after every storm. Hanson's hope is that this moral crisis might awaken a new generation to rediscover what it truly means to be American. Not a label, not a tribe, but a commitment to an idea, that freedom is worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable. As the discussion ends, there's a heavy silence. It's not the silence of agreement, but of realization. Because what Hanson is describing isn't distant or theoretical. It's happening now in real time in schools, media, and homes across the country. The question is no longer whether America is decaying, but whether it still remembers how to heal. Victor Davis-Hanson's warning cuts deep because it's not about politics, it's about identity. A nation can survive hardship, but not self-hatred. It can rebuild after war, but not after forgetting who it is. His message is both a lament and a call to courage. If America wants to survive, it must stop apologizing for existing and start believing in itself again. Because without pride in its past, the nation's future will vanish, not with a bang, but with a quiet surrender to cultural amnesia. Victor Davis-Hanson doesn't mince words when he calls modern America a new feudal state. It's a bold claim, but as he lays it out, it's hard not to see the truth behind it. Once America was the land of opportunity, a place where ordinary people could rise through grit and ambition. Today, Hanson argues that dream is being quietly dismantled by a new ruling class. Economic elites who live by different rules, insulated from the struggles of the people they claim to represent. He calls them the new lords of America. And their power doesn't come from titles or crowns. It comes from wealth, access, and control over the systems everyone else depends on. He explains to Piers Morgan that America's original revolution wasn't just against Britain's monarchy. It was against the very idea of a permanent ruling class. The founders believed in merit, not inheritance, in freedom, not hierarchy. But 2 centuries later, that same aristocracy has returned, cloaked in Silicon Valley hoodies, corporate suits, and political connections. The modern elite, Hanson says, don't own land. They own information, influence, and the rules that govern both. He points first to the tech oligarchs, the billionaires who control the platforms shaping modern reality. They decide what people can say, what news they see, what trends rise or vanish. These platforms pretend to be neutral, but they operate as digital kingdoms, with invisible laws enforced by algorithms. Hanson says these elites are more powerful than any medieval lord because their influence is global and psychological. They don't just rule territory, they rule perception. And the terrifying part is, most people have accepted it. Then there's Wall Street, the financial aristocracy that profits no matter which way the economy turns. When times are good, they collect bonuses. When times are bad, they collect bailouts. Ordinary citizens lose homes, jobs, and savings, while the elite multiply their fortunes through insider networks and government connections. Hanson says it's a system where risk has been privatized for the poor, but socialized for the powerful. The rich no longer play by the same rules, they write them. Piers nods as Hanson connects the dots. How corporate giants and political leaders have merged into one self-serving class. Politicians retire into boardrooms, executives become policy advisors, and lobbyists write the very laws meant to regulate them. It's a revolving door of privilege that leaves the average American locked out. Hanson calls it the feudal loop, a system where the powerful protect each other while pretending to serve the public. The middle class, once the backbone of the nation, is slowly disappearing, squeezed between taxes, inflation, and stagnant wages. Meanwhile, the elite preach equality from their gated communities, flying private jets to climate conferences. He says this hypocrisy defines the new feudalism. The elites talk about fairness but live in fortresses of luxury. They lecture about sacrifice while outsourcing jobs, inflating housing markets, and dismantling the very communities that built their wealth. In medieval times, peasants were tied to the land. Today, workers are tied to debt, student loans, credit cards, mortgages, all feeding the same financial machine controlled by the few. Hanson's voice sharpens. They've replaced physical chains with financial ones. He draws a haunting picture of cultural manipulation. The elite class, he says, doesn't just dominate the economy. It dominates the narrative. Hollywood, universities, and media have become echo chambers reinforcing the same worldview, one that excuses corruption, glamorizes excess, and teaches people to distrust their own country. Hanson calls it psychological feudalism, the belief that the system is too big to change, that ordinary people should simply obey the experts. It's how power sustains itself, by convincing everyone else they're powerless. Yet, as he explains, the irony is that this new nobility depends entirely on the people they exploit. The truck driver, the farmer, the builder, the invisible America that still makes everything work. During the pandemic, Hanson points out, it was the working class that kept the nation alive while elites hid behind Zoom screens. But once the crisis ended, those same elites turned around and called the working man privileged. The inversion is so absurd, Hanson says, it would be comical if it weren't tragic. Piers presses him, is this truly feudalism, or just inequality on a grand scale? Hanson answers with calm precision. Inequality exists in every society, he says, but feudalism is when power becomes hereditary, when opportunities shrink, when mobility vanishes. And that's exactly what's happening now. Children of the wealthy are almost guaranteed success. Children of the working class inherit struggle. Universities, once meant to elevate the poor, now function as gatekeepers for the rich. The dream of upward mobility, the heart of the American story, is fading fast. He warns that this divide won't just destroy economics, it will destroy democracy. Because when people stop believing the system is fair, they stop believing in the system altogether. The resentment brewing beneath the surface is explosive. A society that preaches equality but practices privilege can only sustain itself through force or deception. Hanson believes America is dangerously close to that breaking point, where frustration turns into rebellion, not of ideology, but of survival. But even as he paints this grim picture, Hanson isn't calling for despair. He's calling for awakening. He believes the antidote to this new feudalism is courage. The courage of ordinary people refusing to accept their place as digital peasants. He urges Americans to reclaim ownership of their lives, to think independently, to support local economies, to resist the psychological control of elites who profit from division and distraction. Freedom, he says, isn't taken, it's surrendered. And once you surrender it, you don't get it back easily. As the conversation closes, there's a tension in the air, a mix of fear and determination. Hanson's words cut deeper than criticism, they feel like prophecy. He's not warning of a dystopian future, he's describing the present. The lords no longer ride horses or wear crowns. They wear suits, own servers, and speak in algorithms. But their goal is the same as it was 1,000 years ago: control. Piers sits back, speechless for a moment, then simply says, "That's terrifying." Hanson nods. "It is," he replies, "but it's not permanent. Not if we remember who we are." The message is clear: America stands at a crossroads. One path leads back to independence, hard work, and moral strength. The other, to a digital serfdom disguised as progress. The new feudalism isn't inevitable, but if the people stay silent, it will become irreversible. Victor Davis-Hanson says every nation reaches a moment of truth, a crossroads where it must decide whether to fight for renewal or surrender to decline. For America, that moment is now. You can feel it in the tension of daily life. The anger, the confusion, the disillusionment. People no longer trust the news they read, the leaders they elect, or even their neighbors. The sense of unity that once defined the country has fractured into tribes of suspicion and outrage. Hanson calls it a civilizational fatigue, a slow unraveling of confidence that signals the beginning of decline. Yet, he insists, decline isn't destiny, it's a choice. The question is whether America still has the will to choose renewal. He tells Piers Morgan that every great power in history believed it was immune to collapse. The Greeks thought their philosophy made them eternal. The Romans believed their laws would last forever. The British Empire assumed its reach was unstoppable. But in every case, decay came not from invasion, but from within. When people lose faith in their institutions, when corruption replaces excellence, when comfort replaces purpose, the end begins quietly. Hanson says America is living through that same pattern now, a nation with unmatched power but eroding spirit, distracted by noise while its foundations crumble. He describes how the symptoms of decline are everywhere. A justice system that no longer commands respect, a media that confuses propaganda for truth, schools that no longer teach wisdom but ideology, families breaking apart, faith in free enterprise fading, and public life dominated by resentment rather than gratitude. The national conversation has shifted from, "What can we build together?" to "Who can we blame?" Hanson's voice hardens as he says, when a nation turns inward, it starts to eat itself. But he doesn't stop there. He believes decline is not inevitable, it's reversible. History, he says, doesn't just punish nations that grow weak, it tests whether they can remember what made them strong. Renewal begins when people rediscover courage. The courage to speak truth when it's unpopular, to rebuild what others have abandoned, and to demand accountability from those in power. It's not about returning to the past, it's about restoring the principles that built the future. Hard work, honesty, personal responsibility, and love of country. Piers challenges him, asking if America's divisions have grown too deep to heal. Hanson shakes his head. Division isn't the problem. He says cowardice is. Disagreement has always existed, it's the silence of good people that destroys nations. Renewal requires confrontation, not with violence, but with truth. A civilization can only survive if its citizens care more about what's right than what's easy. Right now, too many Americans choose comfort over courage, distraction over discipline. The decline continues not because the people are powerless, but because they've forgotten how powerful they are. He speaks about the loss of meaning, how technology has made life faster but emptier. People scroll endlessly, connected to everything yet anchored to nothing. Hanson calls it the illusion of progress, the idea that innovation can replace virtue. But he reminds Morgan that no society has ever survived on convenience alone. Without purpose, even prosperity rots. America once found purpose in freedom, family, and faith. Those ideals inspired sacrifice, invention, and greatness. But now comfort has replaced conviction. People want change without struggle, rights without duty, and freedom without restraint. Hanson warns that such a culture cannot last. Yet beneath his stern analysis, there's a quiet hope. He believes America still possesses something rare, the capacity to self-correct. Unlike past empires, it was founded on an idea, not a bloodline, and ideas can be reborn. The renewal, he says, will not come from politicians or elites, but from ordinary people who refuse to give up on the American story. It will begin in small acts. A parent teaching truth to a child, a worker refusing corruption, a citizen daring to speak when silence is safer. Renewal is never dramatic, it starts with conscience. Hanson reminds Morgan that decline isn't measured by GDP or military strength, but by moral courage. Rome fell long before its armies did. The wealthiest civilizations in history collapsed while still appearing powerful. The same danger threatens America now, mistaking material success for moral strength. The skyscrapers still stand, the economy still hums, but beneath it all, the spiritual foundations are cracking. The question, Hanson says, is whether Americans still have the humility to admit it and the will to fix it. He believes the answer lies in leadership, not political leadership, but moral leadership. Leaders who remind people that freedom is fragile, that greatness demands sacrifice, and that unity doesn't mean agreement, but shared purpose. America doesn't need perfection, it needs conviction. The founding generation wasn't flawless, but they believed in something larger than themselves. That's what modern America must rediscover. Not nostalgia for the past, but responsibility for the future. As the conversation draws to a close, Piers leans forward, asking the question hanging over everything. So what happens if we don't choose renewal? Hanson pauses. His reply is simple but chilling. Then we become Rome. He explains that decline never announces itself. It doesn't begin with collapse, it begins with indifference. People stop caring, stop trying, stop believing. And one day, they wake up in a country that no longer feels like their own. Freedom fades not with a bang, but with a shrug. But he ends on a note of defiance. We've been here before, he says. In every crisis, from the Civil War to the Great Depression, America found a way back. Because somewhere deep inside this country's DNA is a refusal to quit. Hanson's belief is that the American spirit, though buried, isn't dead. It's waiting for a spark, a generation brave enough to reject cynicism and rebuild faith in themselves, in their neighbors, and in their nation. As the cameras fade, his words linger. Renewal or decline, two paths, one choice. America's fate won't be decided by its enemies abroad, but by its courage within. Hanson's warning isn't meant to frighten, it's meant to awaken. The clock is ticking, but the choice remains ours. Renewal begins the moment a nation remembers what it was meant to be, free, brave, and united. And if America can still remember that, even at its lowest point, decline will never have the final word.